So I will get started with some introductions as people trickle in, and hopefully we get everybody situated. But I don't want to really spend time on me talking. I really want to make space for the wonderful panel. But hello, everybody. I'm Moira Zellner. I'm co-chair of the Human Dimensions Group at CSDMS. And with Maggie here and with Catherine Arnard, who's running a little bit late, but she'll be joining as soon as she can. We are, so Catherine is the other co-chair, but we essentially thought of and invited Theo Lim, Miyuki Hino, and Gabriela Garcia here to have a Human Dimensions coffee panel. Uh, I don't know, coffee session, or tea or water, whatever you have there, to talk a little bit more about participatory modeling in their experience. And so the way that we're going to structure this is each one of them is going to have 6 to 7 minutes to go over a little bit about themselves in terms of who they are, but also what problems and questions did they address in a particular participatory modeling project that they're going to share with us. And how did they start the process? That's what we're focusing on in this session, as opposed to other sessions we've had in the past. So how did they start the process of collaborative modeling, and what were some barriers, and how did they overcome them? Then we're going to open it up after each one of them does their introduction and their presentation. We're going to open it up with Q&A. And I have some questions, but if you have some questions, please put them on the chat. And then you can jump in during the conversation at that point. Does that sound like a good plan for everybody? Great. Okay, so we're going to go in maybe in order, in alphabetical order, if that's okay. If I remember my ABCs, that would be Gabriela, I guess. You go first. Okay, I'm going to mute.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks for the invitation. I'm excited to be here and to share a little bit about some of the work that I've done using participatory modeling as an approach. And so I think I'll just focus on one application so I can dive into it a little bit more, but happy to talk about other ways in which I've used it as well. But first I'll introduce myself. So I'm an assistant professor at Northeastern University in Boston. I hold a dual appointment between Marine and Environmental Sciences and the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs, where I get to work with and collaborate with Moira. Um, and so I think that that position even highlights some of the intersections where I conduct my research, which is really at the intersection of plants and people. So I'm a socio-ecological researcher. I'm interested in plant ecology and how it influences human well-being and management decisions, and then how that in turn feeds back to influence ecological processes. And so one arena that's really interesting to get at those intersections is farming, and particularly kind of smallholder farming and diversified agriculture. Um, and I have done a lot of different approaches for trying to integrate kind of social and ecological dimensions of a system. And one way that's, I think, pretty compelling for doing that is to use participatory modeling. And in particular, one approach that I've used is fuzzy cognitive mapping or fuzzy cognitive modeling. And so I was keen to leverage participatory fuzzy cognitive mapping because basically a fuzzy cognitive map, you have different, you can map a complex system. And so folks can identify components, which are in a model or a map of a system, and then relationships among them and weighted relationships, and they're directional. And so you can really start to understand kind of the dynamics of complex systems, like so many of our sociological systems are. And it can allow us to kind of bridge the gap between these broadly theorized levers or leverage points for sustainability transformations and actual place-based pathways towards sustainability transformations. And so one way in which one kind of application of that was in the central valleys of Oaxaca in Mexico. I was curious about what are the conditions, the opportunities and constraints on agroecology in the in Oaxaca Central Valleys. So agroecology is kind of maybe best conceptualized for for those of us in the US, against what is the dominant agricultural paradigm here of big monocultures, agrochemically intensive, um, just of one same crop. Instead, agroecology is built on different principles. Actually, could share my screen here. Might be helpful. So one second. I just gotta go into presenter view, or not presenter view. Any view is fine. And drum roll. Here we go. Okay, this is like, we can ignore all of these things. I want to get into, sorry. Boop, 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 boop. This is from a talk from a while ago. Here we go. Agroecology is built on principles of agroecological diversity or agricultural diversity, really prioritizing synergies within the system, highly circular. So rather than relying on external inputs, leveraging ecological processes for plant nutrition and things like that. And it also has all of these social dimensions incorporated, including principles of equity and justice. And so it's really promising in terms of a nature-based solution, and it aligns so many of our ecological and social goals. But adoption, of course, still remains limited compared to these more vast kind of monoculture approaches. Even in Mexico, which is the birthplace really of agroecology, right, the rural communities of Mexico. And so for my postdoc, I was awarded a Fulbright, and I was able to go and work with a transdisciplinary collective in Oaxaca to try to understand what are some of the barriers and opportunities to support broader agroecological adoption locally. And so I kind of was interested in bridging these broader kind of global theories of sustainability transformation, including theories like leverage points for change, with really kind of identifying place-based pathways. And so this is just an example of what a fuzzy cognitive map looks like, different components and relationships among them. And what I did was I worked with agroecological facilitators, or basically agronomists there, to understand from their perspective what are the opportunities and constraints. And I worked with that kind of demographic of participants because they already are thinking in a kind of systems level uh, kind of scale of the system, right? And so I worked with 10 agroecological facilitators to try to understand what are these practices. And actually, I started with one-on-one interviews. From that interview, which was much more conversational, I built kind of post hoc these original fuzzy cognitive maps, and then I sent them to those participants for their revisions or approval. And then I synthesized those and invited folks to a participatory workshop where we revised that synthesis model to generate kind of a final model of the system.
So Gabriela, just very quickly, we are at the 6 minute mark. Do you think you can wrap up in a minute?
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is just a synthesis model that I brought to that workshop, and then folks kind of revised it, and we were able to come up with a much more comprehensive model of the system that's really grounded in the place-based realities. And so that's what I'll end there, this introductory piece. Happy to talk more about it, or the barriers and the various advantages and
Do you
disadvantages.
think that you can maybe summarize some of the like one of the key barriers and how you overcame it?
I think one was, relationship building is so key to effective and equitable participatory work, right? And I was on this funding scheme that was only 9 months max, and so I only had a couple months really for this part of the project. And so one way that I was able to kind of do it despite that limitation was working with a really established transdisciplinary collective that was already in place. And so they have these networks, and that also allows kind of the project to live on beyond my very project focus, right? There's a much broader kind of process in which it was situated, thanks to those partners.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I know that there's going to be probably much more discussion later. So, Miyuki, do you want to go next? And is it okay if I take like a picture of us to share like our smiling faces? Yes. And if people want to, put their cameras on so that Say cheese. Hey, Karen, it's good to see you. I haven't seen you in ages. Oh my goodness. Welcome, welcome, new people. Okay, hold on. I'll take a screenshot. Smile, cheese. There we go. Okay, Miyuki, do you want to go next?
Sure, I'm happy to. Hi, everyone. I'm Miyuki Hino. I am an associate professor in city and regional planning and the Environment, Ecology, and Energy program at UNC Chapel Hill. And I'll be talking today about a collaborative modeling project that I did with Catherine Anardi, who's one of the organizers of this. And a lot of the modeling that I'll be talking about was led by her and her PhD student, Thomas Seeland. So um, we work a lot together with communities and try to tackle both kind of physical science, coastal engineering questions, and the work that I do, which is more on societal impacts of flooding and sea level rise, and thinking more about kind of household decision making, risk perception, and adaptation. So we did this project in Carolina Beach, North Carolina. This is a community that struggles a lot with what we call chronic flooding from sea level rise, high tide flooding, nuisance flooding. Those are kind of the terms you hear. Um, and uh, and our collaboration with them dates back to probably 2021, which is when we had a really informal. We reached out to the planner there for like a really informal conversation about the challenges they face with this kind of flooding, and he gave us a tour around town and pointed out where they have hotspots and what he thinks is going on and what he doesn't know. And at that point, we had no project in mind. We had no nothing, and it was really just a relationship building. Let's connect and let's learn from you. And then I think the year after that, we submitted a Sea Grant proposal to work there with him, and then it's turned into an NSF, like several larger grants, and including work expanding into water quality, which I won't talk about here. But that was how it originally started. So let me share my screen. I'll just share a couple of small things. So for those of you who have not seen this type of flooding before, this is not from Carolina Beach, but this is the type of flooding that we're talking about. And so it can be a totally sunny day, but the water levels in the ocean are very high due to tides, wind, or some other combination of factors. And you get this type of flooding that is we call it disruptive rather than destructive. So it's not flooding tons of buildings and infrastructure, but it's deep enough and long or large enough that it prevents people from getting out of their houses, from going to school, from going to doctor's appointments, and that kind of thing. Carolina Beach, we've had sensors and cameras just like the one that you see out in Carolina Beach since 2022. And the area that we are really focused on is called Canal Drive. It floods about 60 days a year from this type of flooding. So high tides, wind, rain, the combination. So we we had been working on the kind of physical aspects of the flooding problem for a while, for probably several years, and had developed a very high resolution flood model. For those of you who are interested, it coupled AdCirc with 3DI so we could resolve the drainage infrastructure in addition to kind of the ocean scale forces and so forth. But what we hadn't gotten to at all was what to do about it. And so in our collaboration, as we started working there in 2022, we presented to town council probably once or twice a year our updates on what we were doing. And what we were always hearing from them is like, what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do about it? So this was our step into trying to think about how to solve the problems they're facing and not just articulate their problems better, which is what we had been doing up to that point. We initially did a household survey that went to every address in Carolina Beach, and it asked them a bunch of questions about the types of impacts they experience, the types of responses they're interested in, and at the end it said, we're convening a group of residents to meet in a series of workshops. So it's like an 8-hour commitment. If you're interested, please leave your contact information here and we'll reach out. We actually ended up getting, I was hoping for like 10 people to say yes. We ended up with like 120 people who were interested in participating. So we narrowed down to, I think we probably invited 25 or so to begin with, assuming that not everyone would be able to come. And we ended up with about 15 at the beginning. And we went through this series of workshops with them. So the first one was really about brainstorming, like what types of responses would you like to see and where could they go? So we think like post-it maps and that type of thing. And then in the second and third workshops, we shared our model results with them about what those strategies would do to a flood. So to give you a sense of what that looked like, we would put up maps and visuals like this, where we said, okay, this is an example of one of the flood events that you experienced last year, and this is our model output for what flooded. If we did the higher bulkheads that you wanted us to model under current sea levels, this is what you see. You see, like it works really well, right? There's no flooding on this road anymore. So the higher bulkheads in this scenario are very effective. But if you add sea level rise onto that, and you look 20, 30 years out into the future, that picture really changes because the water is coming from a different place. And so the bulkheads that you put there just get bypassed from somewhere else. And in fact, even if you stay at present day sea levels, if you add rain, your flooding is substantially worse with the bulkheads because they trap in the water and don't let it recede back out as quickly as it would without the bulkheads. So this type of diagram and map is what we would share with them in the second and third workshops. And after we shared that information, we'd then discuss with them, okay, how do you want to tweak what you've seen here? So what strategies, how should we change them? Which ones should we continue evaluating? We also talked about things like rough cost estimates, but other feasibility things like one of the considerations was a flood barrier, but there's a lot of boating traffic. So we talked through those types of trade-offs. And then we concluded with more of a group reflection and a public open house for all the other residents to come and see what we had done and talk with us about the results. So that was what we did. One barrier I will highlight is that a lot of the strategies that were of interest here were not really modelable in sort of a traditional modeling sense. So like rain barrels was one example, or development restrictions. And so they were things that you could, in theory, put into the model in different ways, but not in ways that would meaningfully affect the flooding. And so we did have to go through a process of talking through what we could model and what we couldn't model, or what we thought of the strategies that we couldn't model. And I think that connection between these residents who don't think about what parameters go into a flood model, of course, and what we could do scientifically, that was one kind of sticking point that we had to work through on the fly between the first and second workshops.
Great. Thank you, Miyuki. This is giving me a lot of thought for the discussion. Thank you so much for sharing your experience. And Theo, do you want to go ahead and share yours?
Sure. Now let me share my screen here.
Well, Theo is sharing that. Lynn, please check your chat.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Greetings from Vancouver, British Columbia. My name is Theo Lim. I'm an associate professor here at the School of Community and Regional Planning at the University of British Columbia. I'm going to talk a little bit about a project that actually I worked on for a few years when I was a faculty member at Virginia Tech, which is the issue of community heat resilience in Roanoke, Virginia. And just to start us off, I'm taking a very a wide view of what I consider modeling. So if I might say, this is not like a dynamic process type of model. I take modeling to include any kind of um, simplified representation of reality, and that includes maps. So what you see on the screen is a spatial map of air temperatures in the city of Roanoke. Um, and some of you might know this, but in many US cities, the areas of intra-urban heat islands tend to correlate with where social vulnerability is also highest. And so that is the case in Roanoke, where these areas that are shown in a redder hue experience higher temperature exposure, outdoor air temperature exposure, and also correlate with formerly redlined and kind of racially segregated, mostly African American neighborhoods and higher poverty levels in the city. However, when we are thinking about what to do, and so maybe just a little bit about my background, I study participatory modeling both as a critical social scientist, but also as an interventionist scholar. So what I'm going to talk about today is how we use community participation to try to move the needle a little bit on how community responds to the risks of rising temperatures in Roanoke. So we found quickly that these maps did not really capture the experience of heat for many residents or their priorities for action. And so some examples of this were that residents really pushed back, right? So the spatial analyses can show that the areas that are hotter in the city that have higher outdoor air temperatures correlate with areas of the city that have lower tree canopy cover, lower vegetation. Um, and so there's this common framing that, well, this is an environmental justice issue and we can increase implied action is that we should increase tree canopy cover as the appropriate response for dealing with that injustice. But there was a lot of pushback from the community around that as an intervention because of such high levels of distrust towards any government intervention in African American communities because of the history of redlining, urban renewal, mass incarceration, policing, like everything basically that has happened over decades and decades of these residents and multiple generations of being here. And so many of these residents didn't even think, like, were highly suspicious of identifying heat as the issue to focus on because they had been engaged in civic action around issues of lack of transportation or lack of employment opportunities or issues of police violence. And they were very suspicious of, oh, why are you coming in now to focus on this issue of heat that we're not prioritizing? And so that was definitely a barrier, but at the same time, we also know that this community disproportionately suffers from the impacts of rising temperatures, and we want to proactively be able to plan with the community, but have that planning come by the community around this issue. And so what we did was we really broadened how we would spatially represent and the types of activities that would go into this modeling exercise, how we represent the phenomenon of community heat resilience. So we did, things that were included higher resolution mapping so that people could interpret these spatial products a little bit more easily by associating specific landscape elements to surface temperatures and how their bodies feel. We engaged with various service providers who, this is an example from a trauma specialist in the community who is relating the experience of community violence, in this case, a mass shooting or shootings that happen in a public housing complex, to the experience of heat, where people experience safety issues. And that is the main way that they're both experiencing heat and violence. So she's describing the intersection here between parents keeping their kids inside the public housing comp indoors when it's like 20 degrees hotter inside the apartment than it is outside because they're afraid for the safety of their children. We engage with the public school system to have them interview and map their experiences of heat. Um, I'll skip through this, but we can come back. We also did wearable sensor campaigns. And again, this is just different ways of engaging people, including youth and older residents, and showing the data in different ways. We had a high school program where the kids were mapping resident strategies for cooling, and they found that in this public housing complex, that only 34% of the one-bedroom units have air conditioning units in them. And some of them live in this complex. So they're able to couple that data with their own lived experiences of going to sleep in a 100-degree bedroom and how it affects their school and their ability to study and concentrate and all this. And so as we're doing all these broadened activities, including broadening to arts and spirituality conceptions of both community resilience and experiences with heat, we're able to bridge kind of appropriate interventions with matching what the problem is from their perspective, which doesn't necessarily resonate with just outdoor air temperatures. It's the experience in multiple dimensions of life and how they intersect with well-being and safety. So all of this was put into kind of what I'm calling a communicative model, which is a digital platform that acts as a hub for the artifacts that were created by the community, defining what the problem is from their perspective and what potential solutions are. And those artifacts were reinterpreted by the community itself through these all hands meetings and by youth as well. And this is them kind of providing feedback on actions that can be taken to make a heat resilient park in the neighborhood. And then I think, proudest moment was actually getting the neighborhood leaders at the same table to sit at the same table with city staff. As I said, there was huge amounts of distrust. That was a major barrier in the beginning that really prevented any kind of moving forward on potential actions. And this is them going through a participatory budgeting process together on prioritized community projects. So I think that if anyone here has done a participatory budgeting process, it's a very contentious activity to do. So we thought it was good that we were able to do this by the end together. And
Great.
I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Theo, for this presentation. Thank you all, the three of you, for your wonderful presentations. And it's exciting to see like the diversity and the range of different approaches and different degrees and different ways of doing participatory modeling, and for different goals as well, with different kinds of stakeholders and different applications. It's really wonderful to see the range. And especially for the CSDMS community, to see what like all of the things that could be done. I was going to ask, I want to open it up now to more discussion, and with the possibility of you sharing more slides if you want to, as we address some of these some of the questions on the conversation. I did want to start with a couple of questions, and then we can open it up to others. Please, again, feel free to put your questions on the chat. So the first question that I have for all of you, and again, thinking especially on some of the things that you all mentioned relative to the relationship building, whether you had established relationships in the past, you were building on those, where you were focusing on the building relationship first before going, like for a grant together, or something more tangible that you can do, but like really that care of like what is important is a relationship, right? Um, and then also thinking of, what are the things that we can model versus maybe engaging people in the modeling process and instead of reacting to results. So there, again, like different degrees of engagement in the modeling, in the collaborative modeling, and then solution building based on that. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you think that taking a participatory approach to this modeling work affected the impact of your work. So I know Theo showed us a little bit, right, already, but perhaps with Miyuki and Gabriela, we could deepen that a bit more. And then Theo, like if there's anything, like I was left wondering, like, how was the budgeting? Like, yeah, they got to the budgeting, but like, did they go at each other's throat, or like did they actually advance beyond going to each other's throat, right? So Gabriela, Miyuki, Theo, like if you want to elaborate on that, of like how you think that doing this work in a participatory way, because it's onerous, it takes time, is it worth it? How is it worth it? In what ways is it worth it?
Yeah, I'm happy to chime in. Absolutely, it is worth it, I think. But it is onerous. And I think it's worth it because it provides the type of information that can't be easily garnered through other methods or mechanisms, right? And so, like the outcomes of the system model, this complex system model, were far more place-based and like parameterized, like well-defined than I could have produced as someone not local, certainly. Or even build like relying on existing data or other ways that we might use to model these sociological systems. And so I think that that is one way in which they're valuable. But I also think that talking about like the relationship building and how important that is, I think that one of the outcomes or the impacts is the connections and that opportunity for shared learning and envisioning among the participants themselves. And so part of the impact is kind of embedded within the process in a really cool way. So that's just one thought on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think um, for us, because the goal was to, I mean, one of our goals was definitely to kickstart the town's efforts to do something, to like invest in some kind of response. And so we had to have having residents in the room tell us what to model and tell us what they thought about the modeling results was critical. Like we had town staff in the room as well. So we had the lead planner and the lead public works person in the room as well. And they were mostly there to listen because we didn't want residents to put them on the spot and say like, well, what do you think we should do? Because that was not the point. So they were in the room and they could hear the conversations that the residents were having. And I think exactly what Gabriella was saying, this like learning process, it was really interesting because the town themselves and the residents came in totally dead set on bulkheads being the answer. Like they
Yeah.
had been pushing towards that for years. They were 100% sure that bulkheads were going to be the answer. And the idea that bulkheads could make things worse in some scenarios, like if you have rainfall, was not a thing that they had considered or encountered. And um, so showing them the results with a model that was credible to them, like that was the first thing, was that we had spent a lot of we walked through a lot of the model results for events that they were familiar with so that they could gauge for themselves if they felt like the model was doing a good job. And then once we had that, we could show them something like if rain falls, like the bulkheads aren't helping you, they're actually hurting you.
Right, right.
So that was a learning experience. But then ultimately at the end in our exit survey, we asked about like which strategies do you think should the town pursue next? And in the short term or the long, like, do you see these as short term or long term solutions? I think like all 12 of our residents still said the town should do bulkheads. So it's very interesting because like they totally grasped the trade-offs, right? They got it. They were like, I see that the bulkheads aren't going to work all the time and they're not going to work in 20 years. But nonetheless, right? And so it was very interesting because I think for us, we had to be like, the education was we had to see the education as the goal, right? And like they learned, they understood the trade-offs and they still wanted to do that. Those are their preferences. We can't control those, right? And so I think truly that like thinking about the educational process as being an impact was important for us.
Oh, I have stories to share about learning without uptake uh, in different ways. But yes, Theo, go ahead.
I'll just add one thing is this project really made me realize a, a different, like, what is the point of doing participatory modeling? Is not necessarily just to get better information about a system. In our case, the point of doing this participatory modeling was learning to work together, to collaborate across conflict, to communicate across difference, um, and that was what enabled some of the most meaningful outcomes of the project, which is expanded networks and relationships. So the relationship building is not instrumental to building the model. It's actually the other way
The
around.
other way
The
around, right?
um, that we use the model to gather people together, the modeling and research process to gather people together, and through that we provide a supportive environment where people can work through conflict and learn to communicate with each other. And to your point, Moira, yes, the budgeting process was not completely comfortable at all times. There was a lot of conflict over the course of this multi-year period, which contributed to my receding hairline here, because this was like my the majority of my pre-tenure process. So for me, it was a very stressful period to manage the relationships. I won't
Mm.
understate that. Yeah.
So did they get to an agreement?
Yes, eventually, but it was hard. It was very
Of
hard.
course.
Yeah.
Of course, like speaking to the trade-offs, and just to share with you all and with Miyuki too, like being in a situation where learning did lead to shifts in beliefs, and I think that I encourage you, Miyuki, to maybe explore like more integration into the modeling in terms of looking and creating different kinds of solutions, and even showing them the ones that don't, the other things that they wanted to see but didn't get to see because it was hard to model, like the rain barrels. And so we know that they don't do anything, but we included them in our models anyway so that they could actually see that it doesn't do anything. So then they could move, beyond that. But anyway, I don't want to take that the space. There's another question that I have before I open it up for everybody. So given the stress and the things that were difficult, what, like, are there any things that you would do differently, and what would those be, like, given everything that you've learned?
I think one thing for us is that I wish we had been clearer with the town government before we started about their intentions for next steps and the handoff point between us and them at the end of this process.
Uh,
Because ultimately, for the residents who participated, they were like, I think we've learned a lot. I think we have a lot of information now that we can move forward with. And, ultimately, like that is what we handed off was essentially, if you want to pursue this, this is the next step. Right. So one of the things was if you want to pursue this, you need to get actually like an inventory of your underground infrastructure because you don't have that. And that kind of thing. But they were very concerned that the town wasn't going to do anything with all the information that had been generated as part of the workshop series. And so I think if we had beforehand been able to be more explicit get a more explicit understanding of what the town intended to do next, then I think that could have motivated some participation, and I think it could have reassured them that they weren't wasting their time.
right, right.
And so instead, like, we did our best, and the town, to their credit, is doing stuff now. but we couldn't provide any of those assurances. So there was definitely this undercurrent of like, this is great, but what if they just ignore all of it?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's great insight. Great insight. Theo, Gabriela?
Yeah, I can add a little more. I think we could have spent more time upfront on training and team building and um, conflict management strategies, and perhaps devoted more of our budget towards. We involved like over a dozen community-based organizations, many of which we intentionally included because they were quote unquote low capacity. And we had a specific amount of our budget dedicated to nonprofit management consulting, essentially, for those groups to support them and to build their own internal resilience. I think more of the budget should have gone to that looking back.
Mm,
We also had mental health providers as part of our project. I think more of the, more of the budget should have gone to them
oh,
because
yeah.
even members of the team were relying on these.
You needed it.
Yeah, if I'm making it sound scary, I mean, but there was a lot of conflict, and we were working in a community that had intergenerational trauma in it. So there
Right,
was a
right.
lot of misunderstanding around different institutions and processes that we have to follow.
And
Anyway,
there's an aspect there of like trying to be mindful of not re-traumatizing
that's
in,
right.
in
Yeah.
the process. So that's always useful to have that kind of support. But sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that's what I was gonna say there. That's it.
Yeah, thank you. And you, Gabriela, like, is there anything that you would do differently? And, how would you do it differently?
Always. Um,
Yes.
Uh, but I mean, not to sound like a broken record, but I think that time really was the biggest constraint. So I would have loved to um, be able to give more of, so like I did a kind of quick and dirty analysis and synthesis and all of that to share with the community before I left. But basically, I was in Mexico and then had to leave and did a lot of the interpretation after the fact and coming back. And then now I'm sharing it back through my channels there, right? But it would have been great to really be more involved there and to be able to do some of the like the scenarios that then we were able to run with the what I call the consensus model, um, and to get a take on not just kind of running scenarios based on theory and seeing how well it kind of aligns, but more based on what folks think may be the most tractable or what they would expect to yield the greatest impact. And does that actually play out? And if not, why not? And so I think that would have been, yeah, ideal to be able to kind of build those more longer term throughout the whole
Yeah.
there.
And that's a challenge also when we are dealing with our funding
Right.
agencies as well, right? Like, how can we create a culture where that is understood as necessary? And like, how much can we put of ourselves as well? And, which, I always do, but we cannot do that with our students. We cannot do that with our assistants, right? Like so like, how do we create a culture of like, okay, this is why this is necessary, and putting the time and funding that is really needed for this kind of work.
Mhm.
Thank you. Thank you for these insights. Albert here has a great question. How can you build trust in the modeling you are doing? Miyuki pointed out that by modeling historical events, they were able to gain trust. Are there other examples on how to gain trust?
I think one is through kind of the pooling of expertise. And so we're not just one person's, right? But by bringing folks together and kind of building on the collective lived wisdom. At least in this context, there's much more trust basically in that kind of knowledge than maybe in other types of either more kind of scientifically empirical knowledge or other things like that was what are all the things that in fact we cannot get at. And it was really cool to see that the model included not just kind of the more immediate or tangible factors like, oh, how much water scarcity there is, or access to markets for agroecological products, but also like a whole agroecological vision of the system. Like, what is the intent of our food system? Is it maximizing yield and profit, or is it sustaining, nourishing food systems? And so having those kind of deeper elements built into this kind of semi-quantitative model was cool and allowed it, I think, yeah, built the trust that it was a at least effectively accounting for all sorts of different dimensions.
And I think that in that case, it's super important because again, like we tend to, in the modeling world, only represent what we can quantify in some way. But the kinds of approaches that we've seen with, fuzzy cognitive mapping, and then some of the things that Theo was doing in terms of like even the art and stuff that allow for other things to become tangible that are not numbers, right? And that do not have a numerical value. And if they're not represented because they're not numbers, they're not valued.
Yeah.
But yet these are important things to show and put in some tangible form because they are valued.
Yeah.
And that is part of the relationship building. It is part of doing our homework, I think, as participants as well in these kinds of processes and engaging in authentic ways with some of these communities. So thanks for raising that. But yeah, I'll let others
And
also.
just to say, to add to what Moira was saying, I think the biggest trust issue when we first showed the air temperature map is that it did not reflect people's lived experience of how they understand heat to influence their lives. And so how we address that is by making sure that the way we incorporate information into our mental model of what the issue is, that includes things like spirituality and art and other representations of community resilience and safety and comfort and well-being, are incorporated into the process. And that is how you build trust, because then people can see, oh, my experience is reflected here. Yeah.
Yeah, no,
Thank you.
that's a good point, Theo. And just to explain a little bit more about the question, I guess, is that I think models typically, they try to capture the key issues, or at least the models that I work with, but are not necessarily give a good representation of what's happening, right? It doesn't pick up every detail, and especially I think if you're working with local communities, but correct me if I'm wrong, I have not much experience with this, but I'm assuming that people will focus on what they know best, right? Their property, their piece of land. If I take, Miyuki, your example of flooding, there, I'm assuming people will look at their house and know what will happen in the future, what happened in the past, and did I really experience that? And if not, then they're kind of saying, hey, but the model is not doing a good job because that's not how I experienced it. And then, how to get that trust back is I think, could be really challenging. Anyway, so that was basically why I posted this question. So, but thank you.
And I see Greg has his hand raised. I just wanted to say that also sometimes like our own behavior can undermine that trust. And so it is super important that we have that care and humility and understanding of the community that we're working with, that is important too. I just wanted to just make that point of that. Miyuki, I don't know if you wanted to respond to anything that Albert said or to this question, and then we go to Greg.
It's totally true. People were totally picking out their house on the map and looking how deep it was. And for the sea level rise ones too, I mean, it was very humbling because the sea level rise ones, they would look at the map on their little blue dot, right? And it was very eye-opening for some of them. I think being humble, being very open about the limitations of the model and the limitations of what research can do, period, are really important. And we struggle with that a lot because we try to get people to get involved, right? So you want to like get people to be excited about what you can do and engage in the project, but then we also aren't going to turn around and build something for you at the end of it. And so that balance has been really tough for us in all of our community engaged projects to hit.
Thank you. Greg? Oh, you're muted.
I was going to say, thank you all. This has been really fascinating. I'm curious about the extent to which these kinds of approaches are trickling or not into professional practice. I mean, I'm always reading in our local paper about the town council commissioned a study from XYZ consultant, and they prepared a report, and they delivered it to the council, and then the council is going to read it and think about it. as opposed to the kind of things that you all are doing. And it seems like to scale this up, even if all the universities in the world are doing this for as many communities as they can, it's not going to scale. There needs to be some kind of expansion outward from all of your students and all of their good ideas. Is that happening?
I'll let our panel respond, but I will just start by saying yes, but then I'll leave it to you all.
We had a very interesting, so in the past couple of years, as we've been working on the coast in a couple of different places, the state has started something called the Resilient Coastal Communities Program, in which they hire a consultant, typically an engineering firm, to do a risk assessment, and they're supposed to do public engagement as part of that. And so I think the state's requirements are 2 public events minimum, but the idea is the contractor kind of takes the approach that they think is best for getting public input into what the problems are and what the potential solutions are. And I actually did an evaluation of the program. So I talked to a lot of the communities that had been part of it. And I think it was a huge split between the engineering firms and the more the planning firms. The planning firms were like, oh, we go to the farmers market, we go to the local restaurant at lunch where everybody shows up and we set up a table. That's how they do engagement. And then the engineering companies were like, well, we organized an open house at town hall at 1 p.m. on a Tuesday, but no one came. And so there were
well, there you've got your answer.
there were just hugely different approaches to how to involve people in the process. With definite, some contractors very openly were like, that did not go well, and others were like, I think we did the best we could given that people are busy and this is not always the thing they care about most. So I think I think there's intent to do it, and at least in some programs and grants and so forth, public and community engagement is formally part of the process, but the in practice, what it looks like seems hugely divergent based on what we heard.
Theo, did you?
Go ahead, Gabriella. I see you unmuted.
Oh, yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think the issue of scaling is compelling, right? And to what degree can you scale up or scale out? And I think one of the things that is giving me hope in the right direction is that the Nature Conservancy, so it's one of the largest nonprofit private organizations for conservation, they now have a human dimensions team, and they funded some work to even retroactively go back and be like, okay, so we worked hard on this riparian, river restoration. It was to restore this fish to this river, and it worked pretty well from an environmental and hydrological perspective, but they never did any social science. And so now, about 20 years after the kind of catalyzing event, they're having us go back and see what are people's perceptions of it, how did it affect it. And we're doing really, really interesting stuff is coming out of it about kind of the spatial distribution of impacts and how they're distributed across the community for better and for worse, and what are the gray areas and how could they. And part of what we're doing there is not just in this instance, but then what parts of these kind of projects, right, that are actually parts of much bigger processes are scalable? What are kind of recipes for really doing community engaged restoration in this case? And what dimensions really have to be tailored to the context. And so things like lasting and long-standing relationships with the local community and that trust, that kind of fabric of trust, you can't just kind of bring that to a new place, right? That already has to be there. And so what are the kind of the conditions that are pre-existing that have to be there and that we have to nurture in the case that these things arrive? And then what are the ways that kind of lessons learned from particular instances can be applied elsewhere more easily or readily?
So the generalizability of it.
Yeah, great insights from Miyuki and Gabriella here. I'll just add one more thing, which is I I think at the heart of it, we have to reconceptualize what the role of information is in public policy and civic action, and have be very clear on what we mean by transformation, right? So, what is the point of modeling, and how can we think more creatively about what the purpose of the process of modeling is in community? Um, and to say that I think that there's a lot of things going on in higher education, and higher education needing to rethink what its relationship is with civic society and politics as well. And so I think that um, projects like these give us a way to perhaps rethink like what is our role as academics and educators in the current context, and what infrastructure is needed to support this kind of work and to scale it from higher education. Um, I think, I have an interesting thought experiment, right? Like, what if we wanted all research to be directly related to social transformation, what infrastructure in higher education would need to change? Um, And the project that I talked about, this is an example of participatory action research. So like if we were to embed participatory action research into more projects, how would universities need to change to support that? A very different way of working. And one kind of glimmer of hope was that our project was funded through the National Science Foundation. It got over $1 million in funding to do it. And this would not have been the type of project that NSF would have funded, 10, 15 years ago. It really requires a different conceptualization of what is science and what is research, what counts as those things rather than just extension or outreach. And that is like a fundamental rethinking of the relationship between public science, publicly funded science, and society. And I think that there's hope there because not there's a lot of bad things happening in that sphere, but I think there's also hope to redefine what we want it to be.
Thank you, Theo. That's wonderful because it so much aligns, Greg, with what we know. NSF has expressed so much support for participatory modeling in CSDMS, right? And in general in research. But I love that question, that broader question of like really rethinking and questioning our own community, scientific community of like, what is our science for? And what's our relationship with civil society? I think that's a wonderful way to end this conversation today. But like, Maggie, since you've been instrumental also in putting this together, do you want to have like any not to put you on the spot, but I just did.
It's okay.
Do you want to wrap us up today?
Yeah, I think this was really fascinating. I mean, I just really, really appreciated learning from all of your three different perspectives on, very much, we talk about participatory modeling, and often the conversations dive kind of so much into the nuts and bolts of modeling. And I think all of your perspectives on the building the human relations on the participatory side and the challenges and the approaches to addressing those challenges to building true participation were just really fascinating and are giving me an awful lot to think about here. I think it's really cool. And also just the different dimensions with the different populations that you're working with around, things like around Albert's question about building trust and both, and as you were saying, it's not just, kind of Albert, you were talking some about like the building trust in the models, but a lot is also the building trust in the good faith of the people working on the project. And that's where I found it was really cool contrast between sort of, the challenges you were facing, Theo, and then the opportunities, Gabriela, that you were talking about of working with people who already have, a certain amount of buy-in into this. And this is what's fascinating is there's not just one participatory modeling, but what we're seeing here is a range of really different experiences that I'm hoping are going to give a lot of our listeners and are certainly giving me a lot of ways to think about how much anything we do with participatory modeling is so context dependent on the situation, and on who the people are that we're working with. And that's where just getting this kind of rich descriptions of this, and, it makes me think, kind of going back to, some of the anthropology literature and kind of Geertz's whole thick descriptions, work about, you really have to be thinking about who is the society, who are the people, what are the power structures there as we go into this. And I thought this was just a really rich illustration of that kind of the complexity, the richness, and all the different opportunities that show up.
Thank you, Maggie, so much. And I have to teach my participatory modeling class tonight. And I was, in fact, talking about like the context sensitivity of it, which makes it hard to standardize. But what we can kind of like generalize is the principles and the approaches in
Yes.
general, right? Even if like we have to adjust them to the particulars of each case. But so wonderful. And Karen here has actually participated in one of my classes a couple of years ago. So it's great to see you here. Thank you all so very much. I hope we continue these conversations, but thank you so much for coming. We greatly appreciate you all. And thank you especially to our panel.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, and thanks for
Thanks,
organizing.
Annette.
Thank you so much. Take care,
Bye-bye.
everybody.